It's my immense pleasure to introduce to you and welcome to Miami Book Fair, Amir Tibon.
Good evening. Hello. It is such an honor and a pleasure to be here this evening. Thank you to everyone who made it possible for me to be here. Thank you to everyone who came to listen. What I'm going to talk about today is a difficult story, but an important one. And while there will be some difficult moments as I go through the story, I will also try to offer some hope. It's a very personal story, the story of my family, but it's also a larger story, the story of a community that I belong to, the story of an entire region in the state of Israel, the story of a country, and the story of one fateful day, one terrible day that we will always remember, October 7, 2020. That day was actually supposed to be a day of celebration in the small community where I lived until that morning and plan to live again in the future. A community called Nachal Oz. It is a kibbutz, a small agricultural community based on shared values of community and equality. And it was home until that day to 450 people. Kibbutz Nachal Oz was founded in October of 1953. At the time, the founding generation was a group of 60 young men and women, just 19 and 20-year-old, who had enlisted in the Israeli military and were then, after some training, given a mission directly from General Moshe Dayan. You may have heard his name. The mission was to go and build a new community, a new kibbutz, directly on the Israeli border with the Gaza Strip. You can see the area here in the map, and we don't really see Nachal Oz here, but it is the closest of all the border communities. 800 meters from the border with Gaza. Dayan had asked these young, 60 young men and women to go and build this kibbutz based on a national security strategy that Israel had at the time, written by Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, that emphasized the importance of border communities in order to protect the young state of Israel. Trying to enter the mindset of Israel in the early 1950s. It's a very young country, just created after the 1948 War of Independence. It is surrounded by hostile countries. It's not like today when Israel has peace with Egypt and peace with Jordan and hopefully will expand the circle of peace soon. Back then, all of Israel's neighbors are in a state of enmity with this young state. And most of them believe that Israel is a temporary experiment that will soon be wiped off the map. And Ben-Gurion emphasized border communities not just as a way to protect the new borders of this young country, but also as a way to send a message to the people across the border that this young new state is here to stay. He wanted people on the other side of the border, whether it's in Lebanon or in Gaza, like over here, to see the Israelis building new communities, building homes and schools and factories, working the land, doing agriculture, which, as you know, is a multi-year affair, right? What you plant right now, you will only reap maybe a year or two, and that means here to stay, long term. And that was the mission of the young men and women who came to build Kibbutz Nachal Oz in October 1953. Some of them, by the way, are still with us, and they are still young, and they appear in my book. They just happen to be 89 or 90 years old today, but young is relative in our world. And like I said, October 7, 2023 was supposed to be a celebratory day for this community. We were supposed to celebrate our 70-year anniversary. There was supposed to be a big party at the pool of the kibbutz on that Saturday at 7 p.m., marking the 70-year achievement of life across the border from Gaza. Instead of a day of celebration, October 7 became a day of immense tragedy and horror. And I'll get to it in a moment, but I do want to say how I got to live in Kibbutz Nachal Oz. I was not born or raised in this small community. I actually grew up in northern Israel, along the border with Lebanon. The area where I was raised is today abandoned and bombarded. All of the places of my childhood are under fire and without residents, a very sad reality which we hope will soon be resolved. I grew up near the Lebanese border because I grew up in a military home. My father had served for more than 30 years in the Israeli military. When I was a child, most of his career was on the Lebanese arena, and so that's where we grew up. I first arrived to Nachal Oz as a young journalist in the summer of 2014. That summer, there was a 2-month-long war between Israel and Hamas. It was called Operation Protective Edge. There is a computer at the IDF headquarters in Tel Aviv that spits out these stupid names for all the military operations, and then it came up with Tzuk Eitan, Protective Edge, and that's how this war was called. During that war, the 2-month-long war of the summer of 2014, Kibbutz Nachal Oz, this tiny community, at the time just under 400 residents, became officially the most bombarded community in the entire state of Israel. And you ask yourself, why? Why this small place became the one location that Hamas fired the most rockets and mortars at? Well, the answer is pretty straightforward. Nachal Oz is so uniquely close to Gaza, only 800 meters from the border, that it is not protected by Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system. And during that summer, Hamas discovered that when you fire rockets at Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, it makes for great PR. They could go on their television and say, we are bombing the Zionists. But in essence, Iron Dome will take out more than 90% of those rockets. The interception rate of Iron Dome for central Israel is above 90%. Whereas in Nachal Oz, there is no Iron Dome. In addition to that, when Hamas fires a rocket toward Tel Aviv or Jerusalem, the people there have 90 seconds to reach shelter. That's not a lot, not at all. And when that happens, it can be scary. But in Nachal Oz, when a mortar is fired from Gaza toward the kibbutz, you have 7 seconds. And so Hamas realized that if they wanted to get public relations, they should fire at Tel Aviv. But if they actually wanted to kill people and inflict harm, they should target border communities like Nachal Oz, and that's what they did. And I came one day in August of that year to write a story about the most bombarded place in Israel. I was expecting to enter a military fortress, so close to Gaza, under so much fire, and instead, I found myself entering a beautiful kibbutz. Green lawns everywhere, tall trees that were planted decades ago, small gardens around small houses with red tile roofs, and all of it surrounded by open green fields. It was summer, so the sunflowers were in bloom, and I just saw a blinding yellow light from every direction. And I said, this is the most beautiful place in the world. And then a siren went on, and I had to run for shelter, and another and another. And I said, what is this place? How can such beauty exist in the middle of so much war and danger? I wrote my story, I moved on, other things happened. And then in the very last days of the war, a tragedy hit Kibbutz Nachal Oz. A mortar launched from Gaza on a Friday afternoon fell near a home in the kibbutz, and a 4-year-old child by the name of Daniel Tregerman was killed. He was the youngest Israeli victim of that war, and his death opened up a terrible crisis within the community. Almost overnight, more than 15 families got up and left. Parents could not explain to their children why their friend from kindergarten will not come back to start the school year. And a community that on the eve of that war in 2014 had just under 400 residents fell below 300 and kept losing population. And that was when my wife Miri and myself decided we are moving to Kibbutz Nahal Oz. We were living in Tel Aviv at the time. I am working as a journalist. Miri is a social worker. We heard about what was happening in the kibbutz. We heard about their plea for young people to come and lift up this community. And without much hesitation, we just decided to do it. The war ended on August 26, 2014. And on September 26, 2014, we came to choose an apartment. Everybody thought we were crazy, and they were totally right. But we were not the only crazy ones. For the next month, more and more young couples and young families arrived to Kibbutz Nahal Oz. It was a trend of people from all over Israel who said, because of everything that happened, in spite of everything that happened, we are coming to strengthen this community. We are making our home in this kibbutz. And we found ourselves living the dream in this beautiful community, not that far from Tel Aviv. By the way, the distance from Nahal Oz to Tel Aviv is 1 hour and 10 minutes. That's how small our Israel is. From Gaza to Tel Aviv, 70 to 80 minutes. But more and more people came. We were surrounded by young families. We would hike together every weekend and finish our days with a cold beer on the front porch in the middle of the week. We made amazing friends. We had our wedding in Kibbutz Nahal Oz in June 2016, the first wedding in the kibbutz after that war, a small Israeli wedding with 450 guests. Those of you who have been know. And by early 2020, we were parents. We had 2 daughters, born and raised, growing up in Kibbutz Nahal Oz, Galia and Carmel. And while for Miri and myself, Nahal Oz was a choice, influenced by ideology, for Galia and Carmel, it was simply home, the only home they ever known. When I speak about Nahal Oz before October 7, and I write about it in the book as well, I always say it was 95% heaven and 5% hell. The 95% heaven is everything I just told you, the friends, the amazing education, the open fields, nature, community, things that a lot of people are looking for in our world these days. The 5% hell is that it is still the closest community to Gaza. And war between Israel and Hamas in Gaza was a constant threat that would erupt every 6 months or so. And so every once in a while you find yourself at the playground with one girl on the swing and another girl on the slide, and then there's a siren. And you have 7 seconds to take this girl from the slide and catch this girl from the swing and run to the bomb shelter at the edge of the playground. And a lot of times you don't make it. And then you have to cover your children with your own body on the floor. And we are a very secular kibbutz, but in those moments you're allowed to pray. On the evening of October 6, 2023, we were a bit worried. It was Friday night, and the next day was supposed to be the big party in the pool of the kibbutz with all the guests celebrating our 70-year anniversary. And on Friday night, the night before, there was a general rehearsal for the event. And we had to go because Galia, our older daughter, 3.5 years old at the time, was supposed to dance on the stage with her friends from kindergarten. They had to do 2 songs, classic Israeli folk songs. And the first song in the rehearsal, she did amazing. 100%, all the moves, everything on time. But then came the second song, and she began to forget some of it. And she even interrupted one of her friends, and we were really worried. Because if she had a hard time in the rehearsal with 100 people in the crowd, what is she gonna do the next day with the entire kibbutz, which I should mention, by that point had grown to 450 people. Remember when we came there, it was under 300. but there was a crazy population growth and the momentum and a sense of success, and we were 450 on that evening. Everybody was supposed to be there the next day, and more than 200 other guests from outside. And we were just worried, how is she going to do it? So we made a plan. We don't like to worry. Saturday morning, October 7th, I will take Carmel, our younger daughter, at the time just under 2 years old, to the playground, and Miri will stay home with Galia and work with her on the dance until it's perfect. That's how we went to bed on the night of October 6th. That was our biggest concern in the world. We woke up on the morning of October 7th to a crazy barrage of mortars falling on our neighborhood. 7 seconds. So of course what we had to do was get up and run, but run where? Well, in communities like Nahal Oz, on the border, in every home there is a room that we call the safe room. Mamad in Hebrew. If you have relatives in Israel, you know they need to have a mamad in their house. This is a room built of thick concrete, which is supposed to withstand even a direct hit by a mortar or a rocket. And most families in Nahal Oz use that room, that safe room, as the children's bedroom. Think about it, it makes a lot of sense, because then if there's a siren in the middle of the night, or like on that morning at 6:30 a.m., the parents run to the children and not the other way around. And that's what we did that morning. We ran from our bedroom to the safe room, to the bedroom of our 2 daughters. We shut the heavy metal door. We covered the window with a metal plate that is supposed to block shrapnel. We took a deep breath and we felt completely safe. We made it on time. We closed the door and covered the window. The girls continued to sleep. Our daughters do not wake up from explosions and sirens. Growing up in Nahal Oz, they are used to it. And they continued sleeping peacefully. And we thought another round of fighting between Israel and Hamas had begun. These things happen all the time, every half a year or so. It has the same kind of cycle of life, exchange of firepower from both sides. And at some point there's a ceasefire, and we hear from all the important people in the government that we destroyed Hamas and they will never mess with us again. And half a year later, it starts all over again. And that's what we were expecting. And in the dark room, with our 2 daughters still asleep, we began packing. We said, okay, we're going to have to leave the community for a few days. As a lesson of 2014, whenever a new war begins, all the young families with children immediately get out. We don't want another incident like Daniel Traeger once did. And while we were packing, strange things began to happen. At 6:45, the electricity fell down. No electricity in the entire neighborhood. You cannot turn on the light. You cannot turn on the air condition. You cannot charge your phone. Strange. At 7 a.m., we began to hear automatic gunfire. If you will read my book, The Gates of Gaza, you will notice that for the 70 years that Kibbutz Nahal Oz existed, there were always security tensions and security incidents because of its proximity to Gaza. By the way, in the book I also detail a lot of interesting positive moments that this community had with people in Gaza. There was a peace festival in the kibbutz in the 1990s with hundreds of guests from the other side of the border. There were weddings attended on both sides of the border, economic cooperations, tourism. But there were always, fortunately, people who wanted to kill the residents of Nahal Oz. And yet, for those 70 years that this kibbutz has existed on the border, one thing never happened. A terrorist from Gaza had never, ever stepped foot inside the community. And that's why when we began to hear automatic gunfire, we were very surprised. This had never happened before. By 7:15 a.m., our house was surrounded. We were inside the safe room with our two daughters, 3.5 and 2 years old. The door of the house, not of the safe room, the door of the house was locked. All the blinds were rolled all the way down. And we had 5 terrorists surrounding the house from outside, firing into the rooms of the house through the windows in an attempt to break in. Now, I don't know if there's anyone here in the crowd who ever had dozens of bullets fired into their house, but when that happens and you are in one of the rooms, you hear it very, very loud. And that is what woke our girls up. 7:15, they got up from the gunfire and from the shouting in Arabic outside the window, and they asked us, can we go out to play? It's a Saturday morning. Can we have breakfast? Can we turn on the light in the room? The 5 terrorists who surrounded our house were part of a small army of more than 3,000 terrorists from Hamas who had breached the border. More than 100 of them had entered our kibbutz. And now we're stuck with the girls in the room, and we have to tell them that we cannot turn on the light, and we cannot have food, and we cannot go to the bathroom. And on top of that, they have to be quiet. Because think about it, let's try to analyze the situation. We have 5 terrorists outside our house, and they are heavily armed. AK-47s, hand grenades, RPGs, anti-tank missiles, they got everything. We don't have any weapons, and even if I had a handgun at home, I don't think so highly of myself that I would have been able to fight 5 people with the kind of equipment they have. So if we're doing a scorecard here, 1-0 terrorists. The terrorists cannot see our little family, and we cannot see them. We are inside the room, they are trying to break into the house. So it's a draw, 0-0. We can hear the terrorists loud and well. We hear their gunfire exploding inside our house. We hear their shouting in Arabic, a language I had learned and I understand very well what they're saying. But as long as we are quiet in the safe room, the terrorists cannot hear us, and they cannot tell where exactly we are hiding. 1-0 to the Tibon family. But we have to keep it that way. And this was a big challenge because we had a 3.5-year-old and a 2-year-old in the room. And Miri, my wife, she's a social worker. She works with children with special needs. She has a lot of patience. She's very smart and empathetic. And she told the girls in very precise language, without lying to them, without making up some story, just using appropriate words for their age. She said, girls, we're really sorry. We can't go out the room. We can't bring food. We can't turn on the light. And we have to be really quiet because you can hear there are dangerous noises outside the room. There are dangerous people shouting out there. And we have to stay quiet as long as those noises continue. One thing I learned as a parent is that children don't really care what the adults say. That doesn't matter. Children care about what the adults actually do. And in order to convince the girls to stay calm and quiet, we had to be calm and quiet ourselves. Because if we had shown any signs of panic or fear, they would have immediately caught up and understood that something's not right. So we just had to take a deep breath and be very calm and very cool. When those 100 plus terrorists entered Kibbutz Nachal Oz on that morning, they found themselves fighting against a fighting force of 14 men protecting the community. This was a combination of members of our local security team, what we call in Israel Kitat Konenut, residents who are trained and have a weapon at home, and a small police team of a special Israeli police unit that was almost accidentally stationed in our kibbutz a few weeks before. They had a mission unrelated to any concrete warnings, and they were supposed to leave the community on October 8th. So these two forces, the small kibbutz team, the small police team, they join together. They are 14 men fighting against more than 100 invaders. A ratio of almost 1 to 10. And they fought heroically, and I tell their story in my book in great detail. They deserve all the credit in the world. By 9 a.m., out of those 14, 8 are left standing. 2 had died in the battle. 4 were injured to a level where they could no longer fight. So you have 8 men now defending an entire community of 450 people. What these 8 men do, they take an armored vehicle and they start driving around the kibbutz, responding to messages of distress from families. People are sending messages. I have a terrorist in my home. I have a terrorist on my porch. They are trying to break into my safe room. I hear them killing my neighbor. And these 8 guys are driving around trying to save every family they can. And they saved many families, as I detail in the book. But of course they couldn't save everybody, because there are only 8 men in one armored vehicle. And all the time, in the messages people are sending, in the conversations within that little armored vehicle, in the conversations every family is having in the safe room, one question keeps arising. Where's help? Where's reinforcement? Where's the IDF? Where's the state of Israel? When the terrorists began firing into our house at 7:15, I called my parents. My parents are 62 years old. They live in Tel Aviv. My father, Noam, is a retired general in the Israeli army, had served for 30-something years. He retired from the army in 2014, just when we had moved to Nahal Oz. My mother, Gali, is a historian. She writes about the Holocaust and was once a high school principal. And on that morning, they were doing a religious activity. They were at the beach. Tel Avivim, that is their synagogue. So they were swimming. The rockets began falling also in Tel Aviv, and of course they did not get out of the water, because Hamas will not interrupt their sacred Saturday morning beach time. But at some point, when the rockets continued, they began to worry about us in Nahal Oz. And also about my younger brother. My brother is a combat doctor in the IDF, and they thought he might be called to his unit, and maybe his wife will need help with the baby. So, it was over. They had to get out. And then we connected. And I told them, this is not your regular Israel-Hamas exchange of fire. We have been invaded. We are surrounded. There is fire in our living room. My father immediately thought of calling people he knew in the army. He knows the chief of staff, he knows the head of the southern command of Israel, he knows the head of the Gaza border division. Maybe someone will send some forces to Nahal Oz. And he called everybody, and nobody picked up the phone. He started texting them. Terrorists in Nahal Oz. Terrorists inside the kibbutz. The chief of staff wrote back, we know. And that was when my parents took a very unusual decision to drive themselves to Nahal Oz. My father took a pistol from home. My mother said, you need 2 hands. One with the phone to try to call people, one with the pistol in case you run into a terrorist. Let me drive the car for you. And off they went. They first met the war at the entrance to Sderot, which is the largest town in the border area. And they see ahead of them 2 police cars blocking the road, police officers taking cover behind the cars and firing into the distance. And ahead on the road, a white SUV, pickup truck, with armed men firing back toward the police. This inside the state of Israel, inside our country. They had to stop at the side of the road. They couldn't go on. And they thought, what shall we do? Shall we try to bypass? Shall we try to go around? Shall we try a different road? And while they are deliberating, suddenly, from the bushes next to the highway, a couple, man and woman about my age, jump toward their car. My parents look at them. They are wearing party clothes. They are not people who ran away in pajamas from their house or something. They are dressed for a party, and they look lost, terrified, and in grave danger. My parents take them into their car, and they ask them, "Who are you? What are you doing here?" And this couple, Bar and Lior, I write about them in the book, describe the most unbelievable story. They tell my parents that they were at a party in the woods next to Kibbutz Be'eri. Today we all know that party as the Nova Festival, but my parents had no idea about any of this. Missiles and rockets began falling on the festival, and everybody got into their cars and tried to leave. But the terrorists were waiting, and they began to slaughter the people. Bar and Lior saw dozens of people murdered in front of their eyes. They were able to escape, but their car was completely destroyed. And so they had to start running by foot. And they ran and ran and ran until they found this ditch on the side of the road, and they waited, covering themselves with dry leaves. They tried to call the police, and nobody answered. And then they heard my parents and some ambulance that passed in the distance. They got out, and my parents took them into the car. And then they had a moral dilemma, because they had gone out of their home to try to reach their family in Kibbutz Nachal Oz, which is about 15-20 minutes from the place where they picked up Bar and Lior. We are still with the girls in the safe room, surrounded by terrorists, and there's no army in the kibbutz. But Bar and Lior have two children waiting for them with the grandparents in central Israel, about the same ages as our Galia and Carmel. And they did not sign up for this rescue mission. They had just rescued themselves with incredible heroism from certain death. What do you do? So my parents decided to first of all take Bar and Lior to safety. They turn around the car and they drive to Ashkelon, which is 20 minutes north of where they picked them up. They drop them at the entrance to Ashkelon next to a police car, and then they turn around and they start driving toward Nachal Oz. They had some other adventures along the way. I will not bore you with all the details. I will ask you to read it in the book. At some point they had to split. It became too dangerous. My mother stayed in a bomb shelter outside Kibbutz Mefalsim, about 15 minutes from Nachal Oz. My father continued without her, and he found himself running into an active battle between a small force from the Maglan unit, one of the best units of the IDF, a force of 5 heroes, young soldiers and officers, who tried to break Hamas's siege on Kibbutz Nachal Oz. The first military reinforcement heading toward the kibbutz. It was led by a young officer named Chen Buchris. I write about him in the book. This group of 5 heroes ran into a Hamas ambush. Out of the 5, 3 died in the battle and 2 were injured. Another force of paratroopers arrived and joined the fight. One of them was hit by a bullet in the stomach and was severely wounded. My father arrived there and took Chen Buchris's M16 and helmet, because his pistol was useless in this kind of battle. And by the time all this weird combined force, Maglan, paratroopers, my father had finished up the Hamas ambush, the road to Nachal Oz was open, and he could get into the car and drive to us. And again, a moral dilemma. There are 2 wounded soldiers from Maglan, and there is one paratrooper named Yedidia, young guy from Jerusalem, who is on the road with a bullet in his stomach and he's about to die. And his commander of the paratrooper force, comes to my father. He, for the first time, recognizes him, realizes he's got some old general running around his feet, and says, "I need you to take him to the hospital. I want to go on with my men and chase more terrorists down this road. I need you to evacuate the wounded." By this point, it's 12:45. My parents got out of the house at 7:30. It's an hour and 10 minutes. Remember I told you that? An hour and 10 minutes. They've been out for 4.5 hours. And again, what do? He is very close to the kibbutz. The entrance of the kibbutz is 5 minutes away. But Yedidia will die if he's not evacuated. And he's a young guy from Jerusalem who jumped from his home that morning, ran into the line of fire to try to save the people of Nahal Oz, and now his life is in danger. So he tells the commander of the paratrooper force, put him in my car. And Yedidia and the 2 other wounded guys are on the jeep. My father takes them back to my mother. She's waiting at the bomb shelter. He yells her, get out. And he tells her there are 3 wounded soldiers in the car. One of them is about to die. Take them to the hospital. And that's what my mother did. She brought them on time. Yedidia survived. And while he was in the hospital, 2 floors above him, his wife gave birth to a baby boy. And we had since visited and met them. My father found a way to get to Nahal Oz. Again, I will not tell you all the details, you will have to read it. And around 1:15 p.m. he arrived to the kibbutz. And that was the time when a larger reinforcement from the Maglan unit also arrived. And with them, a few minutes later, a group from Sayeret Givati, another important unit in the Israeli army. So now it's 1:15 p.m. and about 100 soldiers are in Nahal Oz, Sayeret Givati and Maglan. They come in, my father joins them, and they meet the 8 defenders from the morning. The 8 guys in the armored vehicle who have been driving alone all over the kibbutz for now 4 hours. Very quickly, they divide the kibbutz into several zones. Each small team of soldiers receive an area to scan. This is a small kibbutz, 450 people. That's about 100 houses. And then you have all the community facilities. The cowshed, the tractor depot, the management offices, the kindergartens, the community pool, the soccer field. And each one of those places has to be searched. And that's what they begin to do, search from home to home, from building to building, kill the terrorists, knock on the windows and the doors of the families, tell them, we are here, you can go out, you are safe. We are in the safe room, we have no idea any of this is happening. We have no communication by that point, our phone battery is dying. And my father joins a group of 6 soldiers and they begin to scan from home to home. They don't really know who he is, but he's with them, he's got a weapon, he's helping them. They go through 20-something houses, and close to 4 p.m., we hear a knock on the window of the safe. And we hear his voice from the other side, and 3.5-year-old Galia says 2 words, Saba Egia, grandfather is here. And for the first time that day, after almost 10 hours, we open the door of the safe room. And then we open the door of the house. He comes in, the soldiers come in, we hug. We bring food to the girls. We have not eaten anything since they woke up. We bring food to the soldiers who have not had anything to eat since they left their home at 7 a.m. and now it's 4 p.m. There were a few very exciting moments, and then the most difficult hours of October 7 began. Because they had a method, these soldiers. In every neighborhood, they chose one house where they concentrated all the neighbors under one roof, because it's easier to protect people that way. And in our neighborhood, they chose our house. It made sense. My father was already there. He had Chen Buchris' M16. The guys knew him. They said, you stay here. We start bringing the neighbors. And with every family that arrived for the next hours, we learned of another tragedy. And we began to hear who is dead, who is injured, who is missing. Later, turned out to be kidnapped. Those were horrible hours. We had 40 people in our house, 10 children. We had to make dinner, we had to entertain, we had to keep everybody in good spirits, and it was very tough because people had been through hell. At 11 p.m., a bus took us out of the community. We were evacuated from our home to a community outside Haifa, which has been hosting us for more than a year now. The last thing we saw as we looked through the window of the bus is the area of the cowshed of the kibbutz completely burned. On that day in kibbutz Nachal Oz, 15 people were killed and murdered, 1-5. 7 people were kidnapped into Gaza. 5 of the hostages from our kibbutz, all the women and the girls, returned alive to Israel exactly a year ago in the hostage deal orchestrated at the time by President Biden. And we still have 2 friends from our community, Omri Miran and Tzachi Dan, both of them fathers of young children, both of them personal friends of mine. Both of them, their stories are told in this book. Today, 1 year and 1 month later, they are still in the hands of the enemy. And I can tell you that for me and all my friends, as long as they are over there, the date on the calendar is October 7. I know that today it is November 17, but for me, as long as Omri and Tzachi have not returned home alive, it is October 7. Right now we are rebuilding, fixing the damages, painting the holes, closing the bullet holes. And the most important thing as we do that is to try to heal our hearts. And for that we need them back alive yesterday, not tomorrow, yesterday. I will end by saying that this is a very difficult story, but it's also a story about family and the importance of family in our life, about community and the importance of community at times of crisis, about solidarity and the ability to put someone else in front of yourself sometimes because somebody else needs help at that moment, and about the spirit of the Israeli people who were tested to the most extreme level on that day. And a year later, through all the difficulty and through all the destruction and the pain, I still have hope for a better future and that we will return to Nachal Oz and find peace. Amen. I will stop here and let everyone take a moment to breathe and digest the story. I know it's a lot. And after you breathe and digest, I would be honored to answer your questions. Thank you.